Hello everyone and welcome to the IRM Switzerland webinar of today. I'm delighted to have Christian Hunt with me. He's going to talk about the dynamics of human risks and how to address them. And quick introduction, myself, Pascal Busch, I'm the chair of the Switzerland chapter, but more important, I'm going to introduce Christian to you. And Christian is the founder of Human Risk, a company that is focusing on behavioral science and addressing the aspects related to these risks. And before that, he was at UBS, managing director and the head of behavioral science at UBS accordingly, coming from a compliance and risk perspective. Prior to that, he was the CEO of the UK Prudential Regulatory Authority. So always at the Bank of England, always related to risks related to behavior. And I'm very interested myself today on what Christian has to talk about. Just for the way we're going to address it today. If you have any questions, please write these questions in the question box or the chat. Christian is going to deliver or give us his presentation, his insight, and we will have a question and answer time at the end of the session so that you can address all the questions you have to Christian. And with this, I'm happy to hand over to Christian. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Pascal. I just need to make sure that I am okay. Looks like I'm now the presenter, which is always a good start. And hopefully, what I'm now going to do is take you through a slightly unorthodox presentation. You'll notice that I am dressed more like a tech person than a risk person, and that's because I want to sort of give you pause for thought and challenge the way that you might think about managing risk. So this is not going to be one of your standard presentations. You know that because I'm controlling it with a PlayStation controller, and that allows me to do all kinds of interesting things and move myself around and hopefully keep you engaged. So let's get started with this presentation, which will hopefully just throw some thoughts out for how we might look at this important dynamic. And what are we here to talk about? Well, we're here to talk about managing the dynamics of human risk. And as Pascal said, that's the name of my company and what I specialize in. And the question people always ask me is, well, what is human risk? And the answer is something that I have defined as the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. And if you are somebody that likes definitions, you will probably hate this because it's really vague. It covers a whole range of things, and that is deliberate. I have covered everything from people who are tired and make mistakes through to people that are accidentally setting out to commit fraud. And so I've tried to cover the full range of things that people might do or not do that can have significance for organizations. And one of the challenges when we think about human risk is it's not straightforward, because it's not just simply a case of people doing things, there's also people not doing things where that thing is really important. And so as we start to reflect on, well, what does human risk mean? It's quite a big, broad spectrum, because we can have active human risk, people actively doing something. We can have them doing it passively. We can have them doing things or not doing things knowingly or unknowingly, and it can be deliberate or accidental. So when we think about humans and getting things wrong, that's quite a lot to be managing. It's not a simple risk in the traditional sense. And then it's a little bit more complicated because, as you'll see at the bottom, I have these two little characters. There we go. Down here, what are they doing? Well, they're a reminder. But very often when we think about human risk, we focus on the person who is effectively caused the problem, or so we think, the person that is responsible for what's gone wrong. But often, actually, it may not be their fault. It may well be somebody else over here who's planned something some time ago, who didn't design something in the appropriate way that's actually caused the problem. So when we're looking at these dynamics of human risk, it's quite complicated. So what's the best way to get into it? Well, the answer is, let's have a look at a few examples of things that have happened that give us a sense of what human risk is all about. And the first example of mine comes from last year. You'll all remember this. This is the Ever Given which was the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Very simple, obvious case of human risk. You've got a captain there who obviously didn't quite get it right. You've got pilots that you have to have that take you through the Suez Canal. Something went wrong in terms of human behavior. And so you could say, well, that was a one-off incident. That's not good. Let's have a look at what happened in that incident. But we can diagnose a little bit further. And if we go back to 2019 to the German port of Hamburg, what we find is that same ship here. And if you look down just sort of where my finger is, if I had it in the right place, you'll see that there's something going on down here. And what's going on down there is what's happening up here. The Ever Given is basically crashing a ferry. This is not the first time that this particular ship had an issue. It's crashed into things before and had major problems. And so here's a really good illustration of something that we might think of as the captain making a mistake or the pilot's getting something wrong, but actually there's something potentially in the design of this ship. The human risk here isn't just in the action of the people trying to steer it, it's possibly in the design of it. And adding to that story is something that happened earlier this year, because I want to take you to Chesapeake Bay on the eastern coast of the US, because here is another one of their ships. It's exactly the same design as the Ever Given. It's not the Ever Given, but it's a similar one. And guess what happened? It got stuck. You can see here on the map, it's sitting outside the shipping channels. There is something inherently challenging about moving these ships around. And yet somebody somewhere has decided that it's a good idea. And what we can see from this is that one simple incident doesn't necessarily give us the full story. There's far more to this than meets the eye. Problems with human decision-making don't just lend themselves to the designs of individual things. They can actually go to the heart of business models. So here's one of my favorite interesting business models from Indonesia. This is a park that they are building on an island, which is designed to allow us to get closer to Komodo dragons. Now, Komodo dragons are the animals that are down there that you can see, and they are not the kind of animal you want to go anywhere near. They are incredibly dangerous creatures, and human beings should stay away from them. So what has somebody decided to do? Well, the answer is build a theme park, and of course, the things that you would expect to have happen have started to happen. It's not even open yet, and there are workers being attacked. I don't think anybody has been killed yet, but it's probably only a matter of time. And you'll see from the newspaper headline at the top that they have called it the Jurassic Park Resort, named after the movie and the book. And you sort of think, well, that's probably a bit unfair, right? Jurassic Park was about dinosaurs. This is about Komodo dragons. But what's fascinating, when you look at the architect's plans, they look incredibly like Jurassic Park. And in fact, what's even more scary is that when you watch the video that these stills come from that shows you what the park will look like, they have actually used the Jurassic Park music in the particular video, illustrating that they have recognized there's something there, but they haven't fully learned the lessons from it. So really good illustration here that even entire businesses can be built around the idea of human risk. And one of the things that we often think about when we think about human risk is that, well, the way we mitigate that is we have senior people who know what they're doing and are accountable and responsible. And that is sometimes a good way to mitigate risk, but it can also cause problems. Let's go back to 2017 and the Oscars ceremony. The Oscars always seems to throw up some form of human risk in action. And you might remember this gentleman, Brian Cullinan. And Brian was a senior partner for PwC, the accounting and consulting firm. And Brian's job on the night was to hand out envelopes. And you may remember that he made the biggest mistake possible. He handed out the wrong envelope just as they were announcing the biggest award for Best Movie. And it was all highly embarrassing. Everybody had to come on stage. They had to give the award, take the award away, give it to someone else. Incredibly embarrassing situation. And what's fascinating about it is, of course, that what Brian was having to do was relatively simple. It's just hand an envelope to people that are going out on stage. And yet, here's somebody with decades of experience getting that badly wrong. And one of the things that's fascinating about this whole story is if you look in the media, Brian did lots of interviews during the weeks before, talking about how different the job looks. Really easy, he says, but it's very complicated. But we have lots of controls in place to make sure things can't go wrong. We have, for example, backup envelopes. And it was actually the backup envelope that caused the problem, because that's what he handed out. So there's a prime example that even when we try and control human risk by having experienced people on hand, and we put in place contingency plans, stuff can still go wrong. And I'm very often asked, well, what would you do? What did they get wrong here? And the answer was they put a senior person on a task that a senior person should never have done. When would Brian ever hand out envelopes? And the answer is never, except when it's got a little bit of glamour attached to it. And he was seen tweeting backstage pictures of himself and the stars, probably getting a bit carried away. And so the answer to this thing would have been, in my opinion, not to put a senior partner on it, actually put a junior person who doesn't like movies, someone who doesn't want to be there at all, who can focus on the task in hand. But it's a really good illustration that when we think about human risk, seniority is sometimes not an advantage. It can actually be detrimental. So we can't conclude that senior people are safe from human risk. If anything, they are in positions where they can cause more of it. And of course, that doesn't mean that all human risk sits with senior people, because we've seen lots of examples, and I know there are some of my former colleagues from UBS who are on the call tonight, who will recognize this gentleman, Mr. Kweku Adebowale. And he, of course, was a rogue trader who decided to undertake something that was outside his normal limits that could, if left unchecked, have taken UBS down. I include him because he was a key part in my career. 7 days after I joined the regulator in the UK, his handiwork became known, and I spent a lot of time dealing with the aftermath of it. So I have to include him because I think he's a core reason I ended up at UBS and doing what I do now. So he deserves a place in the presentation. But he's also a nice reminder that human risk of detrimental proportions can also come from very junior people. He wasn't that senior, and yet he was in a position where he could cause huge amounts of problems. And so when we think about this dynamic of human risk, it's quite pervasive and poses a lot of different forms of risks for organizations. It's so significant, in fact, that I say that human risk is the largest single risk facing all organizations. And you're thinking that sounds like a very bold statement. It is, but bear with me and I'll explain why. And probably to help me explain that, I'm going to turn to my former boss, Sergio Ermotti, the former CEO of UBS, who in 2017 did a really interesting interview with Bloomberg Markets magazine. What he said in that interview was, the riskiest part of our business nowadays is operational risks. We can have hours of discussion on credit or market risks, but the one thing that really hurt in the last 10 years of our industry is op risk, not credit or market risk. And of course, he's talking about things like the Adebowale incident. And here's where it gets interesting, because he then says, if you do something wrong as a bank, or you have people doing bad things within the bank, it costs you much more than any credit risk or market position. What he's basically saying is that the riskiest part of banking is not the banking, it's all of the other stuff that goes with it. And I think that's really interesting, because that helps to illustrate that human decision-making, when it goes wrong, poses a bigger risk in many cases than the core risks posed by businesses. Now, notice one thing with this particular quote. He is trying to draw a distinction between if you do something wrong as a bank, or you have people doing bad things within the bank. Now, of course, that is the same thing. It is happening within your jurisdiction, within your organization, but he's trying to draw that distinction that allows you to say, when things go wrong, here is a bad person, here's a bad apple that caused the problem. But in practice, you end up owning that as a firm. So even if we try and separate it out and say, here's an individual, nothing to do with us, ultimately society will look at it and say, somebody in your organization has done something they shouldn't, or not done something they should, and that becomes an organizational problem for you. And remember, I said human risk was the largest risk facing all organizations. I think it's also the largest risk facing us as a society. If you have a look at the World Economic Forum's 2022 risk report, you can see all of the risks that they list here, and none of them will surprise you. You will probably have some of these in some way, shape, or form on your own risk registers, maybe in a different order, maybe described differently. And what's interesting about them is that many of them don't naturally look like they have anything to do with people. Whereas if we start to look at things like climate, obviously we can have a discussion about what's caused the climate emergency, but the failure to react to it appropriately is a human risk. Even something like extreme weather, let's assume it's nothing to do with the climate situation, it's a total surprise for different reasons. Even that has a human risk component attached to it, because if you don't react to it in the right way, if you don't plan for it, then that becomes a human risk. So the other reason that I say human risk is the largest risk is it may not be the cause of the risk, but if you don't plan, prepare, or react to something in the right way, it becomes a human risk. So human decision-making lives with us in every single risk that we face. And so even if it's not directly caused by humans, the way human beings react or don't brings it into the realms of human risk. And that's why I say human risk is the largest risk facing most organizations. And yet we tend not to think in those terms. And I think that's a bit of a mistake, because if we want to make sure that we minimize risk in organizations, looking at human factors becomes incredibly important. Now, one of the challenges with looking at human factors is we could start to look at the world very negatively and say every single employee within our organization, potentially every single customer, presents a risk to us, and we need to constrain that risk. But of course, if we do that, what we're then doing is we're not getting the best out of those people. And so when I think about human risk, one of the things that's really important to think about is to also reflect on human reward. Now, what do I mean by human reward? Well, I mean getting the best out of our people. And if we think about it, why do we hire human capital in the 21st century? Well, the answer is to do things that machines can't. If we could give a task to a machine, we would give that task to a machine. So we've employed a human being on some level to do something that has human attributes. Might be in customer services where you want a human touch. It might be, managing a team of people. You're not going to get robots to do that. Or it might be to get people to think creatively or intelligently in a way that machines can't yet. Maybe we need emotional intelligence or nuance and judgment. And so as we think about human risk, we also need to think about human reward. How do we simultaneously get the best out of people? And notice I've crossed out the word most, because what I'm trying to get across here is not the idea of exploitation, but the idea of optimizing what we have with our human capital. How do we get the best out of it to meet the challenges that we're facing? And the reason I put these two things together is if you overdo the human risk piece, you think too hard about it, you end up with your seesaw facing one way. You will mitigate risk, but you also will miss opportunities. But even the other side, if we just unleash human reward and we say to people, do whatever you want, whatever it takes, we will generate huge amounts of human risk. And so the challenge facing all of us in the 21st century is how do we balance those two things out so that people do the right thing, we get the most out of them, but we don't have them unleashed and causing us problems. And that's the balancing act that we need to look at. And the trouble with that is that unlike other resources that we invest money in, humans do strange things. And so if we want to get this right, what we need to do is we need to start thinking about the human algorithm, what is going on inside people's minds. And if we can crack that, then we have an opportunity to start building an environment and a control framework that will allow us to mitigate that. And the problem with the human algorithm, and I think of it very much as an algorithm, what goes on in here is like a computer program, is that we can't upgrade our hardware yet. We can't really reprogram the software. So the only thing that we can do is to start to control the data that goes into the algorithm, because we've got very limited control of what happens inside it, because the processes are already hardwired. But what we can do is to influence the data that goes in, and therefore hopefully drive the decision making that's going on. And the problem with the algorithm inside the brain is that it's programmed for one thing and one thing only, and that is the survival of the human species. It's programmed to make efficient decisions. And those efficient decisions aren't necessarily always what we might think of as intelligent decisions. And I'll give you an example here. So this is some COVID statistics from Germany. This was last year. That's what they showed in the media. And if you just looked at these charts, you would just think things have got a lot worse. So you've got the March stats there, the April stats here, but of course, because you're smart people, you're going to look down and go, ah, they've changed the scale. So actually what looks terrible here isn't anywhere near as bad as it seems, but our initial reaction is we jump to conclusions very quickly based on the information that's there. And a perfect example of that is this. This is a lovely piece of art. And it's there, and it's designed to be provocative. It says right at the bottom here, down there, it says this is a test. And the test is that most people that see this will draw a very rude conclusion. I think it's very offensive. But of course, that's just one possibility. The go F yourself could be very rude, but it could also mean go feed yourself, go find yourself, go free yourself. It could be a very positive message, but we tend to jump to conclusions because our brains are draining. We want to solve the problem, we solve it quickly. And if we try and solve it quickly, we can get the wrong answer. So have a look at this picture. You all know who this is, Prince William. And you can see that what he's doing to the press here, he's fed up with the press who are hounding him, and he's giving them a very rude signal. Only he isn't, because if you look here, you can see what he's actually doing. What he's actually doing is showing them how many kids he's got. It's a very positive, uplifting message. He's outside the hospital where his new baby had just arrived. But you wouldn't know that from looking at the other picture. And of course, we don't often have the ability to see things from different angles. But it's a really good illustration of how our brains can jump to conclusions very, very quickly. And that can be very dangerous. And the way that information is presented to us can also lead us to draw the wrong conclusion. So here is, let's talk politics for a second, a genuine set of opinion poll questions that were asked to the same audience in the UK a few years ago. And they asked the audience that they were talking to, the population they were talking to, would you agree with reducing the voting age from 18 to 16? And you have 37% in favour, 56% against. So a clear majority against that. And yet, if you ask them the same question in a different way and say, should we give 16 or 17-year-olds the right to vote? Magically, it flips the other way. And this is a really good illustration that the way things are presented to us determines how we respond to it. So we're not these intelligent creatures that will always come with the same answer. How things are presented can lead us to draw completely the opposite conclusion. And so when we think about human decision making, both in terms of people that might do things we don't want or not do things that we do want, but also ourselves as risk managers, it's very possible that we can look at the data and come to the wrong conclusion. And that's why I say it's really important that we think about the information that's going in and try and control that, both ourselves, but also the population that we are trying to control. And then we do other interesting things like we pay attention to new exciting things, we ignore things we've seen before. And so this is an illustration of what happens when you put someone's head in an MRI scanner. So you're scanning what's going on and you show them a new stimulus, maybe a piece of music or a picture. For the first few times that they see it, there is a lot of activity going on in the brain. So we react and we respond accordingly. The more we see or hear that same thing, the more we're subjected to the experience, the less activity that goes on, such that by the time you get to 24 times of seeing something or hearing something or responding to something, we don't really pay much attention. We're on autopilot. And that is how we build habits. So it's great if you can build a habit that way that's positive. But of course, it's also what leads people to ignoring things, to normalizing things that they shouldn't normalize, to getting themselves into bigger trouble in terms of committing crime, because we're not thinking about it anymore. We are on autopilot. It's a very effective way of saving brain capacity, but it's very, very dangerous if the thing that we're doing is something that probably we shouldn't be doing. And so the dynamic of human risk isn't even static. It can get worse as time goes on because of some of the things that we have inbuilt in our brain. And I want to stress that the processes in our brain make sense on certain levels, but it starts to get a bit more problematic in the 21st century. We've seen simple things like my perspective might not be the same as yours. We live in a very polarized world where people have different views on things. And so here you can see these two gentlemen who are both entirely correct and entirely wrong at the same time. We see things from our own perspective. We tend not to think about things from other people's perspective. And we often don't reflect on the information that isn't available to us. We don't think about what it might be like from someone else's perspective. We don't think about the data that we might not have. And there's a lovely example from the Second World War, where a Hungarian mathematician called Abraham Wald was called upon to help the American Air Force, and they were losing lots of planes. And so what he was called in to help them think about how they could more effectively protect planes, and they got the data that told them where planes were being hit. And so this is an approximation of the information that, well, here's the spots the planes get hit. And the plan was, well, what we'll do is we'll protect those bits of the aircraft because we know that's where they're being hit. Let's pre-shield the aircraft and then we will be a lot safer. And what Wald rightly pointed out was that the data set that they were looking at was the planes that had made it back. See, far from being the points where the planes were vulnerable, what this actually tells you is where the planes can be hit and still make it back. So Wald's point was, actually the data that you've got here is not the entire data set. We need to think about the data that you don't have. And the data they didn't have was obviously the planes that hadn't made it back, because they hadn't made it back. And so he suggested something very counterintuitive, which was, let's cover up the bits of the plane that haven't been hit on these. Let's leave the bits that you think are the vulnerable bits, and let's protect the bits that haven't, because presumably that is where the other planes are being hit and not making it back. Unfortunately, they went with Wald's plan, and that led to a massive improvement. And it's a really good example of where we don't often think about the data that we're sitting on. We will take it at face value. We will assume that that data is correct, but actually it might not be telling us what we think it's telling us. So questioning the data that we have, and particularly the data that we don't have, is quite significant when it comes to thinking about managing human risk. And one of the challenges of human risk is that sometimes people who do things or don't do things don't have very much experience. And there's my favorite human risk story ever comes from Pittsburgh. And this gentleman here is called MacArthur Wheeler. And it's a slightly grainy picture, but you can hopefully see he is trying to rob a bank. And MacArthur had done a little bit of research before he decided to rob the bank, which was that he wanted to be invisible. He knew that there were cameras there, and he wanted to make sure that he couldn't be seen. So what he did was he read up about making invisible ink, and he discovered that if you put lemon juice on paper, you can use it to make invisible ink. It's not terribly effective, but it's one way you can do it. And he just assumed that if he put lemon juice on his face, it would make him invisible from security cameras. And as you can see, it didn't really work, and they found him very quickly. And he genuinely couldn't understand how he had been caught. This was confusing for him. And so this intrigued a couple of academics called Dunning and Kruger, who set about doing some research into what we call the Dunning Kruger effect, which I'll paraphrase very simply, is a case of, at its most extreme, is I'm so stupid, I don't know that I'm stupid. I don't recognize my own ignorance. And that can apply to all of us in certain situations where we might not have much knowledge. And if we start out with very little knowledge, one of the things that can happen is we can very quickly build a picture that's quite simple. We like things to be simple, we like simple narratives, and so we can build a picture that makes sense to us given the knowledge that we have. And as Daniel Kahneman, the author of this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I recommend to anybody that hasn't read it as a sort of book on this piece, says, it is the consistency of the information that matters for a good story, not its completeness. Indeed, you will often find that knowing little makes it easier to fit everything you know into a coherent pattern. In other words, we are programmed to think that we know more than we actually do. And that's really good for survival. We don't want to be confused and asking questions all the time. But in the 21st century, that poses us a real challenge because the people that we are trying to control, the employees and potentially the customers and stakeholders, may not realize what we don't know. And we, as we examine risk and look at it, may underestimate our lack of knowledge. It's an incredibly powerful tool for survival, but it's incredibly dangerous from the perspective of thinking about human risk. And one of the other things that we do to reassure ourselves that everything's okay is we look at what other people are doing. And if you've ever traveled somewhere, you'll know that the way you decide how to behave is what is everybody else doing? How are they behaving? And of course, that can be very good if you're copying people that are worth copying. But very often it can lead to really bad decision making. So here's my favorite example in the UK last year. There was a little bit of a fuel crisis. There was some panic buying going on, so lots and lots of people rushing around buying fuel. And of course, the system isn't designed to withstand that. There's not much contingency. And there was a problem with tanker drivers having COVID, possibly some post-Brexit challenges as well, that meant that supply was threatened. And so people went around panic buying because they saw other people were panic buying. And in fact, it got so bad that people were so desperate that they started to drive around looking for tankers as they were going to petrol stations. And there was a gentleman here carrying mortar, which is nothing to do with fuel, it's a building material, in his tanker. And he found he had 30 drivers following him because they thought he was a petrol tanker, and that was inside information that would enable them to get some more fuel. And what's interesting about that is that the longer it went on, the more people joined. And so you had this convoy of ill-informed people copying each other. And that's a really good example of how we can easily get waylaid and mislaid by other people. So we can convince ourselves that what we are doing is a good thing because other people are doing it. And that's quite a challenge because it's very difficult to persuade you if you're seeing lots of other people doing it that it's not a good idea. And so that can become literally viral and quite infectious. And so when we think about how we manage this challenge of human risk, again, it's not static because it depends on what else is happening in the environment. And so that's the human brain operating. But the story gets worse because if we start to think about, well, how do we currently manage our human capabilities within organizations, we do some things that are not particularly helpful. And I'll just take a few silly examples that will help you to think about some of the ways that we get the worst out of people. So we've got a difficult situation in the first place, but our structures and our processes can make it even worse. And here are two of my favorite bits of the devil's work. Yes, that is PowerPoint, and yes, that is Outlook. Why do I think they are awful? Well, if you think about what PowerPoint does, is it generates possibly the most boring meetings you've ever been to, encourages people to produce big fat decks. But what it's doing is basically, particularly when you put slides up and you present them, what you're basically doing is taking a piece of paper and projecting it on a wall. That is not an engaging technique. And a really simple example of that would be if you think about movies and the credits at the end of a movie, they use white ink on black because it's easy to see. What do we do when we put PowerPoint presentations together? We usually put black ink on white. Why do we do that? Well, because that's what we did when we printed out a piece of paper. Printing was very expensive. You wanted to use as little black ink as possible. And so we would print black on white paper. There is no reason in the digital world why we continue to do that. It's harder to read, and yet we continue to do that. And that's before I even get into PowerPoint templates that constrain people's thinking, that encourage them to use hideous clip art, that encourage people to just produce monotonous, boring things. It is the worst tool possible for limiting people's creativity. And what happens in PowerPoint presentations is that useful information goes missing and the boring stuff rises to the top. So it doesn't help us when we're thinking about mitigating risk and getting the best out of people. Why do I hate Outlook? Well, email is terrible. If you think about it this way, it's a to-do list generated by other people. We wouldn't let other people, under any other circumstance, keep disrupting us, telling us what to do and shouting orders at us. And yet that is what email does. These things come in and we have to respond to it. It's a really bad way of getting the best out of your human capital, encourages all sorts of terrible behaviors and adds a whole load of stress. It's not a particularly smart way of managing human capital. And then let's think about meetings that we go to. Well, what do we do in those meetings? Well, historically, we would have a meeting like this, not very diverse, as you can see, lots and lots of white males sitting around a table. What's the first thing that we do in a meeting? Well, we read the minutes from the last meeting. Seems logical, doesn't it? Well, we want to make sure that all the things we agreed would happen have happened. But if you think about it, what does that also do? It reminds you about the previous meeting. So if you've ever been to a series of meetings where it feels like the same thing is happening each time, it's like Groundhog Day. That's why. Because we've started a meeting in reference to the previous one. We've reminded ourselves of that terrible experience we had last time. And so we shouldn't be surprised that when we come around to it again, we just repeat the same performance. It doesn't get the best out of us from a human reward or from a human risk perspective. And then let's think about some of the materials that we use to drive those meetings. So here is a typical sort of risk dashboard. What will most of you naturally do, quite understandably, is we'll focus on the reds. Let's have a discussion about the reds. So anybody that's bringing a point that is responsible for that area that's a red will, of course, be prepared to talk about it. If you're responsible for green, if your whole thing is green, and of course the meeting becomes a game of how can I get as many of my things onto green as possible, you know that you're probably not going to have to talk about things. And you might say, well, of course, that's good because we're talking about problems. But here's the way to think about it differently. If you are just talking about the reds, you are talking about known problems. If it has been flagged as red and identified as red, it's a known problem. Someone is already looking at it. Where is the future problem lurking? Probably not in that. It's probably sitting in the green, the thing that has never, ever gone amber or red. And yet we never talk about those. We structure our meetings to talk about the things that we think pose the biggest threat. And yet, in many cases, they don't. So the structure of these discussions is often designed in a way that doesn't focus us where we probably ought to focus. It's important to make sure that we're remediating known risks. But if we're spending all our time talking about things we know, we're not going to be talking about the things that we don't know. And if we think about the human algorithm as needing data, well, where does all of our data come from? Well, we know historically there's a lot more male data than female data. The world that we've built up, as Caroline Criado-Perez in this amazing book highlights, lots of things in the world are designed around men. Bulletproof vests, crash test dummies, and a whole load of other data is based around the male body and not the woman's body. And that, of course, makes it unsafe for women. And that's just one example of legacy data sets that are not necessarily indicative of the current or the future world. And they might not have been any good for that, but we take them and use them in the analysis going forward. And so that can pose us quite a few challenges. And if we go forward and think about technology, we know that when people are using technology, they tend to be a bit more flippant. Think about the stuff that people put on social media. Think about the way that people carelessly send emails. Well, what happens when we start to get into the metaverse and we start to have people wearing headsets like this that takes them into a completely different world? That poses a whole lot more risk. We have blind faith in technology, and sometimes we overtrust it, like when people slavishly follow their GPS units and drive into rivers. And so technology is actually, yes, it's helping us manage risk, but it's also in some cases making us a lot dumber. And as we think about technology taking over the repetitive tasks that they can take over, human beings are going to be spending more time doing things that require human skills. That makes them more risky because we're doing things that are concentrating human risk. So in the last few minutes, having thrown some thoughts at you, I'm just going to give you a few ideas about what we can do to ethically hack these dynamics. That is why, of course, I am wearing my own hoodie. And how do I know it's ethical hacking? Well, my hacker here is smiling. So that means he or she must be ethical. So what are some tricks that we can pull to try and mitigate some of these things? The first one I think is really interesting and kind of obvious, which is give ourselves a bit more time. As this beautiful ad for, yes, you guessed it, a Swiss watch says, don't crack under pressure. Very often we are making decisions at breakneck speed, and we know that when we make decisions quickly, greater opportunity to get things wrong. So time becomes critical. If we can slow things down, if we can think a little bit more, that gives us more opportunity to be more intelligent. The other thing is to think very carefully about what we're looking at. And here are some ads from Colgate, the toothpaste people. And what you'll notice here is it's highlighting the really obvious point that it's very noticeable when you have something stuck between your teeth. So advertising clearly pointing out that flossing is a good thing. But what you might not have noticed, because you're focusing on the teeth, is that this guy here only has one ear. To really give an illustration that when we focus on something, we are focusing on that and not noticing other things. Here's another one. You look at it again, you're focusing on his teeth, but ask yourself whose arm that is. You probably haven't noticed it because, again, we're focusing on one thing. We're looking at the obvious thing. We're not focusing on the other information. And then this couple, again, in the third ad as they get older, again, you'll see his teeth is the most important thing, but have a look at the arm over there. That has quite a few extra fingers attached. So really an illustration there that sometimes we focus on what we think we're going to be looking at. We have committees and processes that focus on stuff we know. We remediate for risks that we understand. We don't often think about the risks that we don't. And that applies to us and, of course, the people that we are trying to influence. So humans are easily persuadable, which takes us nicely to Donald Rumsfeld, the US former defense secretary, who a few years ago talked about known knowns, the things that we know, known unknowns, the things that we know we don't know, and the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't even know that we don't know. And at the time, everybody laughed at him and said, who is this idiot, what a fool. But I think he was onto something, because we don't often think about what we don't know. We think about what we do, and we're programmed to make decisions on that basis. And we deliver structures that are focused around the knowledge that we have, not necessarily the knowledge that we should have. Next trick that we can pull, courtesy of Mercedes, who ran these lovely little ads for some pre-safe brake, which is basically a preemptive braking system, saying, well, they've covered this, right? So that nothing happens even when the unthinkable happens. We are programmed to naturally want good outcomes. We are not very good at thinking about things that might not happen. If we think something is unlikely, we've never seen it before, then we are likely to ignore it, put it lower down the risk register. COVID is a really good example. Coronavirus, the countries that managed it best to start with were the countries that had seen similar things before. Those of us in Western Europe who had not seen anything along those lines made interesting comparisons with the flu and various other things that weren't necessarily relevant. We need to think the unthinkable, and we need to build structures and design that and allow crazy ideas, because if we just rely on what we know, just rely on what we think is going to happen, we are going to cause ourselves no end of problems. We're going to miss things. And we've seen that in recent years, and as the world gets more complex, that becomes more of an issue. The other thing that's really important to do is to make sure that we bring in as much diverse opinion as we can. Cognitive diversity matters. And if you want to see how not involving other people's opinions leads to stupid decision making, you have your perfect example here from this gentleman. And the contrast couldn't be richer between the man that listens to other people, who engages people, who speaks with people, and lets people have opinions. And we mustn't just allow the traditional people into the room. We're going to think about, as we are managing risk, that some of the risks that we're dealing with, experience and expertise may not solve. What do older white men know about the experiences of young black women? What do digital immigrants, i.e. those of us that haven't grown up with technology, know about things that digital natives have grown up with? We can't necessarily have the expertise to deal with everything. And yet we often bring in senior people in meetings when actually maybe those senior people don't understand things. We need to broaden out the brain power that we are using. The final thought I have for you is that we need to rely a lot more on anecdotes. We need to rely on stories, because what we very often do when we're looking at risk management is we often try and simplify the world. And here's a beautiful example from Swiss artist and comedian Ursus Verli. And what he does is he makes things tidy. And so here's a lovely piece of his art where he has tidied up a fruit salad. And I love this because this is what we do when we present risk registers. We try and take complex things and make it simple and easy to understand. And what he's done here is he has produced a beautifully formed, very well organized fruit salad, but that bears no resemblance to the actual experience. Another one of his works, and he's on tour, by the way, doing an amazing show later this year in Switzerland, highly recommended. Have a look at this. The reality of the world is what we see here. That's what the real world looks like. And yet, when we do risk management analysis, we like to make it look like this. It's very pretty, it's very simple, but it doesn't reflect the realities of the world. And so what we need to do, as well as using data, is to also use anecdotes. And you don't have to take my word for that. You can listen to the man who runs one of the most successful companies on the planet, Amazon. And he says, the thing I've noticed is when the anecdotes and the data disagree, the anecdotes are usually right. There's just something wrong with the way you're measuring it. And I think that's an incredibly powerful message that says, let's not just look at raw data. Let's also think about the stories that are out there. What's actually happening? Because in all of the processes that we've designed, we are deliberately filtering a lot of this stuff out. Right? We're trying to make it simple. We're trying to make it clear. We take the information we've got and we present it in a way that makes it clear. But that misses things. And so what we need to do is to bring more stories into the room and try and process those alongside the data so that we don't just know what is happening, we know why. So quick recap of the 5 ethical brain hacks: slow things down, ask what is missing, think the unthinkable, practice cognitive diversity. That doesn't just mean people look different, you want people to think differently, and rely much more on anecdata. With all of that said, I'm going to do 2 things. One, point you to this QR code if you like this stuff and want to subscribe to my newsletter to get more sort of insights like that. That's how you do it. Just take a picture of it. And then notice here what I've done is used a little behavioral science trick. I haven't said, do you have any questions? Because if I said that, you could say no. What I've said is, what questions do you have? And that means I'm expecting you to ask questions. It's okay to ask questions, and I'd love to hear what they are. Thank you for watching and listening.
Thank you very much, Christian. That was entertaining and insightful both ways. I also want to encourage you, the audience, to ask your questions. Please use the questions box or the chat. Until we get further questions, one question. So this was very generic, great examples. When you get engaged by companies, what is it usually about? Because they know you are the human risk person. What is the engagement about?
So I will help people to solve problems that they want to solve, right? So if somebody isn't interested in solving it, there's no business for me being there. So I tend to work with people that have recognized that there may be some flaws in their processes. And so I will work with them to identify what those might be and how we can improve things. And that can range from, we've got one specific thing that's just not working. We've got a policy that people aren't following. We've got a risk that's just out of control. There's something not working the way we want it to, and we recognize it's that human component that's not clicking. Rather than going down the traditional approach of just doing more, could we think about solving the problem differently? And so I help them to think about changing processes, and that's everything from communication, management information, the structure of controls, the way we talk about risk management, the culture that's behind it. Look at all of those factors and say, what can we change? And the amazing thing is that very often we come in, I come in and I look at a specific issue or a range of different issues. And what happens is I'm trying to help my clients to think for themselves. And so it's not about me coming in and going, well, that must be this. Is I just have some ideas and I try and spark them to think about their problem slightly differently. And then together we try and solve it, leaving them in a position where, one, they've solved the problem, or at least things are better. And the second thing is that they have a good understanding of how we got there, so they can own it. So if there's a regulator they need to explain it to, it's not just some guy told us how to do this, it's they can stand behind it and say, here is the behavioral science behind this. This is why we thought this was a good idea. We've run some experiments to test this out, and that's the solution there. So I work with a range of different industries, from chemical weapons inspectors, financial services, obviously given my background, but retailers, pharmaceuticals, tech companies, broad range of different companies to solve their specific problems.
And just to add to this, because some of the results might be counterintuitive, is it usually that it is accepted? Or do you have then challenges where people don't really follow the results?
So sometimes the processes that companies have put in place for very good reason, right, are just a bad idea. And we can identify that they're a bad idea. So a good example would be, lots of people have policies that employees don't follow. And then you look and say, well, why are they not following that policy? Well, the answer is it's 500 pages long. It's really complicated. It's very difficult. You told them about it 8 months ago. They can't remember it. And the system that you want them to use for this particular purpose doesn't make any reference to the policy. So we should, there's a really simple clue where you say, perhaps if we made the policy a bit shorter, changed the system slightly, did a few other things, we can get a better outcome. And so in many cases, it can be really obvious. Where it's a bit more complicated, and maybe we need to do something totally counterintuitive, like, for example, removing a control. And I very often come in and say, this is not always going to be adding things. Sometimes we've put things in place that cause more harm. And so that feels really dangerous, right? Removing a control. But what you do then is you demonstrate, so we have the basis for making that decision, which is the science behind it. We think about the situation, and then we run an experiment. And we say, does this actually improve things? And generally, if it does improve things, people are quite excited and interested and want to implement it. So there's a lot that's scientific about this. But sometimes you don't need to do the science, because when you think about it, it's really, really obvious why. You know, a good example is induction training. Lots of my clients throw everything they can into the induction training. You know, we need to give you all this stuff. And then people forget, or they don't care, or they're interested in, have I made a bad decision joining this company, or where do I get my coffee? They're not interested in learning about the operational risk framework. And so when you look at those sorts of things, it's pretty clear. You just go, well, let's not throw things at people on day one. Let's find a more structured way to do it. And so in that case, it's reasonably obvious that making that change is likely to have a greater impact. But the real thing I love doing is taking examples from other contexts. And that's why I've talked about things that you will recognize. And one of the things that my bit of advice to people is, if you're looking at your process and in any other circumstance where you had a similar challenge, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't ask your customers to do it, or you wouldn't like doing it yourself at home or when you went shopping. And ask yourself why you're doing it in that work context and whether that's likely to be successful. Because more often than not, we ask our employees to do things, and we go through processes that we kind of know anything outside of work, we wouldn't put up with it. So I always say, why are we putting up with it in the work context? And if we can start to think like that, we can recognize things ourselves that perhaps are not as well thought out as they could be.
We have a couple of questions I see. I just follow from the bottom. What advice would you give to incorporate the story or anecdotes in risk register heat map reporting and discussions?
So I think it's a great question, right? Because what I'm basically doing is bringing in something. It's almost like you're serving steak and I'm going, we need to serve some fish as well. And you go, well, hold on, we don't have doesn't fit nicely into that category. And of course, the reason we love data is it's simple. You can present it nicely, you can analyze it nicely. When you start talking about anecdotes, it gets a bit more challenging, because how do you quantify that, and it feels awkward. So the first thing is gather it, collect it, and start thinking about collecting it, because you can't even start to solve the problem if you're not collecting it in the first place. And that's really, really important, not just to collect it sort of when things go badly wrong, but very often when we have things blow up, there are small indicators on the way that things are happening. And so thinking about gathering lots of small bits of data can start to get you a bigger picture. So it's important to gather the right sort of stuff. The second thing is then you can start to use technology to filter a little bit, seeing, you know, things like word clouds seem a bit silly, but that's not a bad start point to start to look at it. But I use anecdotes in the way that Jeff Bezos outlined it, which is gather all the anecdotes, look at the story you think you've got from the data, and then say to yourself, well, where are we being told things that don't make it? Where do these two things not sit together? And that's his point around then go get more data, and collect more anecdotes as well, and let's work out what is going wrong here. So what you're looking for is tension between what you think is going on based on what you can see and what your people on the ground are telling you is going on. And so how do we gather that data that's going on? Well, you know, we can do all sorts of things. We can go and interview people. We can go and pay attention to records. There are lots of records kept for various other reasons, but we don't think to tap for what does this tell me. If we wanted to look at the risk, if we're a bank and we wanted to look at the risk profile of a particular client, what's fascinating is we tend to record lots of things for customer service. We'll record things that we have to do for a regulatory basis. So we'll tick all the boxes, and then we might record interactions from a customer services perspective. But what we don't think about is what do we pick up from a risk perspective? Are there things that are strange here? We're getting lots of people who are engaging with this client who've all got a sneaking suspicion. So finding opportunities for them to record that, make it easy for them, make it simple, and collating that can give you a really interesting picture. So I'm not saying throw all the data out, or you suddenly have to quadruple the length of the meeting because you're reading every single thing anybody's written about this. But it's really about looking for richness that's there, because as I said before, the data is stuff that has happened. It comes from the past. What we need to do is think about anecdotes can be slightly more forward-looking, and they contain an element of human judgment. And when I talk about people as posing risk, they're also your best form of early warning system, because whenever something goes wrong in an organization, someone somewhere knew something that would have been useful. They might not have known the full extent or the full details, but that's the bit you need to look out for, is where can you tap this stuff? And giving employees an opportunity to feed that in, absolutely critical if you want to get that. So there isn't a hard and fast answer, But if you're not even gathering the data in the first place, you've got no chance of doing that. But the start point, I would say, is get the data and then look for contradictions between, so get the ANEC data and look for contradictions between the ANEC and the data.
Thank you. We have two further questions, and we have John, one of the members of the Switzerland committee, who would like to join the discussion in a minute. But so first, one of the other questions, you mentioned that we cannot reprogram the brain's algorithm, but we can train it to react in a different way. What would you say about this?
So, I mean, clearly we can, if you look at how the reason I say that is we often, if you think about, if you're trying to lose weight or trying to start a new hobby or build a new habit, that we find that really, really difficult. And so one of the ways, how do we get people to exercise more? Well, we incentivize, we make it easier for them, give them the personal trainer. We find, give them ways that they can fit it into their existing routine. And so what we're doing is presenting the same thing to them in a slightly different way. And so, Mike, I'm not saying you can't change people's minds on things, you can't change the way they look at things. You absolutely can, but it's really hard. And we often go about it by trying to reprogram people. So when something goes wrong in an organization, it's bad people doing bad things, we need to reprogram them. What I'm saying is recognize why they might do that. And a lot of it is not people's, you've got a very small percentage of people that will set out to deliberately do the wrong thing. Most people are trying to do the right thing and trying to get through outcome. They want to do a good job, but for some reason it's not happening. Trying to reprogram them is difficult, but if you can present things to them in a different way, as we do in lots of other contexts. Why do we buy washing powder? We don't buy washing powder because it's the most effective. We buy the one we've heard of. There might be a price element in there. The advert makes sense. It feels like a reputable brand. It looks like it sort of cleans, but we don't scientifically know which one is best. We go on gut reaction a lot. And that's the bit that we can try and influence when it comes to human decision making. So it's a simple message that hides a much more complex truth. But I'm saying that because I want people to start focusing not on changing people's minds, is think about the subtler stuff that we can do, because that's a lot easier and a lot more effective.
The other question that came is, what are the best methods that can be used to identify risks from humans?
Other humans is the most effective way. So if you think about it this way, whenever, we all have a sort of intuition for things that aren't quite right. And so we see people that look a bit suspicious. We know in the office who we think is doing something strange, or if we're being asked to do something that feels a little bit odd, or we're seeing other people behaving in a strange way. So we're influenced by the people. We can also detect what they're up to. And so that's why, whistleblowing is incredibly powerful as a mechanism, because it's human beings. And if you can't generally give people a checklist, here's the things to look out for, because you don't know what situations they're going to be in. So encouraging and incentivizing people to come forward, make it easy for them. Don't make it stressful. Don't make them think they're going to get into trouble for coming forward is a really powerful way of doing it. And people talk about the human firewall to get people to protect the first line of defense against the cyber criminals. And it is to an extent, but there's also the human radar. People have a sense of awareness. You just have to tap into it. And so if we ask the right questions and we have the right processes, people will tell you stuff, providing they trust you. And that's the really critical bit to set up. So that's my biggest tip, is use your people as radars out there that can help you identify things.
So John, if you could join now, if you unmute yourself. Seems like it doesn't work.
Well, while he's doing that, let me just say, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I know you're only supposed to connect with LinkedIn with people you've met, but you've listened to me for this long. So if you're interested, please feel free to do that. You'll just search for human risk on LinkedIn. There's my infomercial while we wait for John.
Yeah. So for some reason, it seems we can't unmute him here. Sorry for that. Yeah. So we have one further question. Oh no, maybe John. No, it looks like it works.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very good. Yeah, hi. So thanks, Pascal, and hi, Christian. Great as ever to listen to you. I had a couple of observations. One, I guess, is the link to culture. The difference between two organizations, one where the average person is keeping their head down. They might stray across the line if everybody else is straying across the line, and they're unlikely to speak up about something that doesn't directly impact them. The difference between that organization and one where, you know, people value the rules, stay in line and speak up if they see something wrong, to me is culture. You know, we're all inherently likely to be malleable or to be bystanders if that's what we observe around us. And so I guess the point is, I think there is a massive dividend. If you want to invest time and energy, I think if you can do it in building a good culture, a good risk culture, it pays off in every process, in every control you have to design, because your average person is just trying to do the right thing rather than being, you know, liable to go astray. The second point was about Rumsfeld, because we often talk about that model, but actually about how he missed out the fourth quadrant. If you logically think there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns, there's a fourth quadrant, which is unknown knowns, by which we mean basically stuff you should know about, but you don't. So it went wrong in one part of your organization, but you didn't do enough work to read across to learn it into another part of your organization. And going right back to the beginning of your presentation, the examples where basically the same company has the same problem time and time again, they're suffering from unknown knowns. So those were the two observations.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. But what's interesting about the culture one is obviously there are lots of things that impact culture, and that's remuneration, broader incentives, the sorts of people you're hiring, the way you talk to them, blah, blah, all those kinds of things. What I think is interesting is that the risk function can play a role in influencing that. You can't do it on your own. But if your risk processes are clunky, punitive, bureaucratic, theoretical, i.e. not human, then you are not playing your part in that particular piece. It won't solve it on its own, and you're absolutely right to draw that broader context. But I do think, and I point this to compliance colleagues as well, is if you want to change how people perceive control functions, the control function has to take the first step. There's a little bit of dance to be made there. And so I agree that broader context is there, but there are things that the risk and audit and HR and all these other functions can do to help shift that along, because this becomes a critical piece, is how people see their information being handled. The information you feed, so if you've got the right culture and it feeds into a bureaucratic machine that is incredibly punitive when it gets that information, is trying to do, it does bad things with it, you're not going to respond. But I agree with your broader piece. If you have the wrong culture, you're fighting a losing battle on the risk front. On the Rumsfeld thing, I agree. I mean, I think it's fascinating is knowledge sharing and the read across. And one of the things I see lots of companies doing is they remediate for that one specific issue. And so they're not thinking holistically about where else, and it might be called something completely different in a completely different context. Where else have we got similar attributes? So imagine we've got a policy that's 500 pages long that no one's reading. Let's just not fix that. Let's also go, which other policies have the same challenge? And because the same risk will probably apply in those things. That's a read across. In that case, it's a read across the number of words. But actually, if you think about it from the employee experience, is saying where else is the employee experiencing something like that? So something irritates somebody in context A. If a similar process is irritating in context B, then that's really important. Now, you might not identify the attributes from looking at it, but people will tell you and go, I really hate that. And if somebody hates a particular process, that is the first thing they're going to circumvent when the opportunity arises, and they can create that justification. So I think there's an interesting thing there around saying we need to think about how do we knowledge share more effectively, and how do we again use people, because you're right. I mean, those two examples were very public. So you would kind of hope that a large company that had big crashes and incidents like that would have learned from it, but clearly they haven't, or they're just not, or they view the fines that they're paying to be worth the price of the screw-ups. It's factored into the model. I don't know.
I think the critical thing is to really identify the root cause and to read across on the root cause. So, you know, as you said at the beginning, maybe the process is badly designed, or maybe the person is lazy. If you read across the wrong root cause, you're completely wasting your time. So you need to work out really what's caused the issue and then read that across. And if it's the policies are too complex, then as you say, look for all the other policies that are too complex. But if it's something else, then you're kind of solving the wrong problem.
And the other thing that's worth remembering is, of course, if you ask people, we often don't know why we do things. And so if you said to people, why did you do that? They will come up with a reason that makes them look as good as possible. That may not be the actual reason. And so finding that out, that's why experimentation is quite important with these things, because you may think you've got the answer, but people may, even if people are trying to be cooperative, they may not realize. But you're right, that read across thing is very important. If you chase the wrong thing, you can solve for something that doesn't exist to make things worse.
We ran a bit over the hour, so thank you very much to everyone for staying with us. I think it was very interesting. Thank you, Christian, for being with us, for sharing your insights. If you have any further questions, as Christian offered before, reach out to him. I'm sure he's very happy to answer these questions and to be in touch with you accordingly. From our side, from the IRM Switzerland chapter, thank you for joining, and we look forward to the next session. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
All right, thanks.